I was raised by a woman who never owned a refrigerator until she was 41 years old. Not because she was poor, because she didn't need one. Her mother before her, and her mother before that, kept meat in this house through every winter, every drought, every season where the nearest town was a 2-day wagon ride, and the nearest butcher shop was something that simply did not exist in the life they lived. They raised animals, they slaughtered them in autumn, and they kept that meat through spring, through summer. Sometimes through the following winter too, if the season had been good and the work had been done right. And the work was always done right. Because they knew something. It cost them $2, sometimes less. It required no electricity, no chemicals that you cannot pronounce, no vacuum-sealed plastic pouches stamped with expiration dates decided by a corporation that profits every single time you throw food away and go back to the store. It required salt, the right kind, prepared the right way, applied with the knowledge of women who understood that meat was not perishable by nature. It is only perishable when you handle it the way they taught you to handle it. I am going to show you that method today, exactly as it was shown to me. But first, I need to tell you something that the meat industry has spent the last 70 years making sure you never find out. In 1953, the United States Department of Agriculture published a revision to their home food preservation guidelines. It was a quiet revision, a technical update, they called it. Most people never read it, and the ones who did assumed it was about safety. It was not about safety. The revision effectively discouraged home curing, the process of preserving meat using salt alone, in favor of refrigeration and commercial packaging. At the time, the refrigerator industry was expanding rapidly. Electrolux, General Electric, Frigidaire. These companies had just come through the post-war manufacturing boom, with factories full of capacity and salespeople covering every county in America. They needed American households to believe that a refrigerator was not a luxury, but a necessity. And the fastest way to make a refrigerator necessary is to make everything that existed before it seemed dangerous. So they did. The old salt-curing knowledge, the same knowledge that had preserved meat for every civilization that ever existed, from the Roman legions marching through Gaul with salt-packed pork in their supply wagons, to the Dakota homesteaders who put up an entire hog in a single afternoon and ate well for 18 months. That knowledge was reframed as primitive, risky, something your grandmother did because she had no choice, not because it worked. Here is what actually happened. The methods worked then. They work now. The science behind them has not changed. Salt draws moisture from meat through osmosis, drops the water activity to a level where pathogenic bacteria cannot survive or reproduce, and creates an environment that favors only the preservation of the meat itself. This is not folklore. This is chemistry. It is the same chemistry that makes salt-cured prosciutto from Parma, Italy, carry a 24-month shelf life. It is the same chemistry behind country ham in Virginia, behind bresaola in the Alps, behind biltong in South Africa, behind every salted and dried meat tradition that every culture on Earth independently discovered. Because the method works so reliably that humans figured it out on every continent without any communication between them. But you are not supposed to know that. Because if you know that, you do not need to buy refrigerators every 12 years. You do not need to buy vacuum-sealed packages with expiration dates. You do not need to drive to the butcher shop every week. You do not need to throw away the roast that sat one day too long in the back of the refrigerator and now smells wrong and goes into the trash. The industry built its entire business model on your dependence on the cold chain. On the belief, planted carefully in guidebooks and health pamphlets starting in the 1950s and reinforced in every decade since, that meat without refrigeration is meat that will kill you. My grandmother cured meat in a barrel in the root cellar for 4 decades. She died at 93. She was sharp until the last month of her life, and she could still tell you, from memory, the exact ratio of salt to meat that her own grandmother had taught her in the kitchen of a Nebraska farmhouse in 1921. I know that ratio. I am going to give it to you today. The method is called dry curing, and it is the oldest form of meat preservation in human history. You need 3 things to do it correctly. The first is the right salt, not table salt, not iodized salt. Iodized salt contains additives that interfere with the curing process and can create off flavors in the finished product. What you need is pure, non-iodized salt, either pure sea salt, pure kosher salt, or the salt that was traditionally called pickling salt or curing salt, which simply means salt with nothing added to it. At any grocery store, a 2-pound box of non-iodized sea salt costs between $1 and $2. That is your entire investment in this process. The second thing you need is the meat itself. The dry cure method works on virtually any muscle meat: pork, beef, venison, goat, lamb. It works best on cuts with some density and structure. Pork belly, pork loin, pork shoulder, beef round, beef brisket, venison haunch. Thin, tender cuts do not benefit from long curing. What you want is a cut with substance, something your grandmother would have called a good working piece of meat. The third thing you need is time and temperature. The curing environment should be cool. Between 34 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit is ideal. Though our grandmothers had no thermometers in the root cellar, and they worked with what the season gave them. A cool basement, an unheated garage in late fall or winter, a root cellar if you have one. The process requires consistent coolness, but not the extreme cold of a freezer. Freezing actually interrupts the curing chemistry. That is everything. $2 for salt, the meat, a cool place, and what your grandmother knew. Here is the process exactly as Clara Root learned it, and as her grandmother learned it before her. Start with your meat. If it is from an animal you raised or had freshly slaughtered, you want it to be fully chilled, below 40 degrees all the way through, before you begin. If it is from a butcher or a grocery store, it is already chilled. Good. Look at the meat and note its weight. You are going to calculate your salt by weight. The traditional ratio that our grandmothers used, and the ratio that has been validated by modern food science, is 1 ounce of salt per pound of meat. Some older recipes call for 1¼ ounces per pound for longer preservation, up to 2 or 3 years. For a 3-year cure, use the higher ratio. It creates a firmer, saltier finished product, which is exactly what you want if you are building a pantry for the long term rather than curing a ham for Christmas dinner. Weigh your salt. This is the one step where you do not want to guess. Too little salt, and the meat may not cure fully in the center. Too much salt is not a safety issue. Oversalted cured meat is simply very salty. But for the first few batches, use a kitchen scale and follow the ratio exactly. Now prepare the salt. You can cure with plain salt alone, or you can add flavoring agents that our grandmothers also used, not for preservation because the salt does that on its own, but for flavor. Black pepper, coarsely ground. Dried juniper berries, crushed. Brown sugar in a ratio of about 1 part sugar to 4 parts salt, which slightly softens the flavor of the cured meat without reducing its preservation. Bay leaves, dried thyme, dried rosemary. These are additions only. Everything else is the kitchen. Take your measured salt, or your salt mixture, and apply it to the meat. Every surface. Press it into the grain of the meat with your hands. Do not be tentative about this. Work the salt into every face, every edge, every depression in the cut. The coverage needs to be complete. If salt does not reach a surface, that surface does not cure. Place the salted meat into a clean, non-reactive container. Glass is ideal. Ceramic crocks are what our grandmothers used, and they are ideal. Food-grade plastic will work if you have nothing else. What you cannot use is bare metal. Salt reacts with metal, and you will contaminate the cure and potentially the meat. Cover the container. You do not need to seal it airtight. A cloth tied over the top, a lid set loosely on a crock, a plate weighed down with a clean stone, All of these are what our grandmothers used. It requires coolness, time, and the undisturbed chemistry of salt pulling moisture from meat. Place it in your cool space and leave it, now. Here is where I need to slow down and explain what is happening inside that container, because this is what the modern food establishment does not want you to understand. And it is what makes the difference between someone who tries this once and gives up and someone who builds a pantry that feeds their family for 3 years. When you apply salt to the surface of meat and place it in a cool environment, the salt immediately begins drawing moisture out of the meat cells through osmotic pressure. This process is called dehydration, and it is the first mechanism of preservation. Bacteria need moisture to survive. Every gram of water that leaves the meat is a gram less of the environment in which dangerous pathogens can grow. But the salt does not only draw water out. In the first hours and days, the salt also begins migrating inward through the moisture that exists within the meat. It is traveling into the interior of the cut, slowly, the way groundwater moves through limestone, methodically, completely, following every channel and fiber. This inward migration is what gives a properly cured piece of meat its preservation all the way to the center. The outside cures first, the center cures last, and the time you give the meat is the time required for the salt to complete that journey through every fiber. This is why cutting open a curing piece of meat to check on it is one of the few things that can ruin the process. Every time you cut into it, you interrupt the salt migration, introduce potential surface contamination at the cut, and allow moisture in from the outside. Leave it. Trust the process your grandmothers trusted. The chemistry is working whether or not you can see it. After the first 24 hours, moisture will begin pooling in the bottom of your container. This is called the brine, and it is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that everything is exactly right. The brine is the moisture the salt has drawn from the meat, and in that brine is a high concentration of salt, high enough that it is itself a preserving environment. Your grandmothers did not pour this brine away. They kept it. Some of them added it to vegetable ferments. Some of them used it to start the next batch of cured meat. Nothing was wasted. Nothing needed to be. Every 2 to 3 days for the first 2 weeks, you will flip the meat in the container. This ensures even salt contact on all sides and even distribution of the brine. If the brine level drops, which can happen if the container is not well sealed against outside air, add a small amount of additional salt water. 1 tablespoon of non-iodized salt dissolved in 1 cup of clean water. Keep the meat in contact with its brine. After 2 weeks in the initial cure, your meat has begun its transformation. The surface will be firm. The color will have deepened. Pork will take on a darker pink to red color. Beef will darken toward burgundy. The smell at this stage is distinctive. It is a clean, mineral, sharp smell. Salt and meat and thyme. Not the smell of rot. You will know rot if it occurs. And if the salt was applied correctly and the temperature maintained, it will not occur. This is what the meat has smelled like in curing cellars for 10,000 years. Do not be alarmed by it. Be reassured by it. Now the cured meat enters its next stage, which our grandmothers called the equalization period. During this period, the salt that is concentrated near the surface of the meat migrates further inward, evening itself out through all the tissue. For a large cut, a full pork belly, a beef round of several pounds, this equalization takes another 1 to 2 weeks in the cool environment. You can continue flipping the meat every few days during this period. After equalization, you have 2 choices depending on what you want your finished product to be and how long you intend to store it. The first choice is to stop the cure here, rinse the meat briefly with clean water to remove surface salt, and hang or store it as a soft cured piece of meat. At this stage, it can be cooked directly, sliced and pan-fried, added to soups and stews, used in any recipe that calls for salt pork or salt beef. This was how most daily cooking used the cure. Not a long-term storage piece, but a working pantry item that keeps without refrigeration for 6 months to a year in a cool space. The second choice is what creates the 3-year pantry item, and this is the method I want to teach you in full. After the equalization period, instead of rinsing the meat, you press fresh salt into the surface again. A lighter coating this time. Not the heavy initial application, but a firm renewal of the salt barrier on every surface. Then you wrap the meat. Our grandmothers wrapped in clean cotton cloth. You can also use cheesecloth. Some families used paper, heavy, unbleached paper, dampened with the brine and pressed tightly around the cut. The wrapping serves 2 functions. It holds the surface salt in contact with the meat, and it protects the exterior from insects, dust, and moisture from the air during the drying phase. Once wrapped, the meat is hung. Hanging is the step that most people have been told is dangerous, and it is the step that makes the longest preservation possible. When you hang a properly salt-cured piece of meat in a cool, dry, well-ventilated space, air circulates around the entire surface. The remaining moisture in the meat, the moisture the equalization phase has moved into a stable, salt-saturated state, continues to evaporate slowly. Over weeks and months, the meat dries from the outside inward. The water activity, the measure of available water that bacteria can use, drops further and further below the threshold of pathogen survival. The meat becomes progressively more stable, not less, as time goes on. This is the paradox that the modern food industry has used to confuse you. They have told you that time makes food dangerous. Time for properly salt-cured and hung meat does the opposite. Time completes the preservation. Time is what turns a 2-week cure into a 3-year pantry staple. The hanging environment needs specific conditions. Cool, as we have discussed, below 50 degrees is ideal for the first months, though as the meat dries and its water activity drops, it becomes more tolerant of fluctuation. Dry, not dessert dry, but low enough humidity that the surface of the meat dries without becoming damp. Our grandmothers hung their meat in root cellars in winter, in smokehouses in the transitional seasons, in the cool north side of barns during summer. They read the conditions of their space and responded to them. If a summer was unusually humid, they brought the meat in closer to the house where the cooking fire dried the air. They were not following a government safety checklist. They were reading their environment the way people who keep meat alive have always done. Ventilation matters because air movement across the surface of the hanging meat carries moisture away. Stagnant air lets the surface stay damp longer and can create conditions for mold on the exterior. A small amount of surface mold, white mold, not black or green, on a hanging cured meat is not cause for alarm. It can be wiped away with a cloth dampened with a strong saltwater solution. Our grandmothers wiped mold from their hanging hams without any sense of emergency. They understood that the white molds that appear on the surface of salt-cured meat in a curing environment are not the dangerous molds of spoilage. They are the same family of molds that appear on the surface of aged cheese, and they do not penetrate into properly cured meat. What you are watching for, and what will tell you that something has gone wrong, is not mold on the surface, but softness in the meat itself, areas that press with your finger and feel wet or give in an unusual way. A properly curing piece of meat should feel progressively firmer over time. It should feel like it is becoming more itself, more concentrated, more definite. If you press an area and it feels wet or spongy, you address it immediately. Remove the cloth wrapping, reapply a heavy coat of salt to that area, rewrap, and move the meat to a drier location. 9 times out of 10, caught early, the issue resolves. By the end of the 3rd month, the meat has dried significantly. It has lost somewhere between 20 and 30% of its original weight, which represents moisture loss. It has deepened in color. If you unwrap a corner and cut a thin slice, the interior will be firm, darker than fresh meat. And when you taste it, because tasting is the oldest quality check there is, you will find salt, depth, and a richness that no commercially processed meat achieves. This is the taste that my grandmother's table always had. This is what people mean when they say that food used to taste like something. Between months 3 and 12, the cured piece continues to age. It becomes harder, drier, more concentrated in flavor. It is in this period, the 6 to 12-month window, that the meat is at its most versatile. A thin slice cooked in a dry pan fills a kitchen with the smell of something worth eating. Added to beans, it transforms the entire pot. Added to soup, it does what a bouillon cube is a pale and chemical imitation of. It gives the liquid depth, salt, animal fat, and time. Beyond 12 months, the meat does not deteriorate if conditions have been maintained. It simply continues to dry. Some of the traditional European salt-cured meats, the Spanish jamón ibérico, the Italian culatello, are aged for 3 to 5 years. The Smithfield ham, which is an American tradition, with direct roots in the same salt-curing knowledge my grandmother used, carries a legal designation that requires a minimum of 6 months of aging, and in traditional form may be aged for years. These are not artisan exceptions. They are the evidence that this method, done correctly, does not have an upper limit that equals danger. Time is your ally here, time and salt. At 3 years, the meat is not fresh. But it is not supposed to be fresh. It is preserved. It is what it was intended to be. It is the thing on the shelf in the root cellar that you reach for in February when the ground is frozen. The store is a long drive on uncertain roads, and your family needs to eat. It is the reason the families who knew this never worried about that moment. Now I want to tell you what this knowledge actually costs, and what you are buying every time you choose not to use it. A 2-pound box of non-iodized sea salt, $1.79 at most grocery stores, or slightly more at a specialty store if you want a fancier variety. A 5-pound pork belly at current prices runs about $15 to $20. With 2 pounds of salt, more than enough to cure it and reserve the surplus for the next batch, you invest roughly $17 to $22 total. The resulting cured meat, properly prepared, will give you 1 to 3 years of shelf-stable protein that requires no electricity to maintain. Compare this to what modern cold storage actually costs. The average American family spends between $120 and $150 per month on electricity, and roughly 20 to 30% of that electricity goes to refrigeration. That is between $24 and $45 per month, between $290 and $540 per year. To keep a box cold that still fails you when the power goes out, still requires you to throw out whatever sat too long on the wrong shelf, still produces the same food emergency your grandmother's method was specifically designed to prevent. The method costs $2. The dependency costs $500 a year, plus the vulnerability. They knew which one to choose. They always knew. The last thing I want to give you today is the practice, not the knowledge alone, but the practice. Because knowledge sitting unused in your head is not a pantry. It is not protection. It is not the thing your grandmother built her family's security on. Start with 1 piece of meat this week, not a commitment to cure your entire chest freezer. 1 pork belly, 1 flat of beef, whatever is affordable and available to you right now. Follow the ratio, 1 to 1.25 ounces of salt per pound of meat. Cover every surface. Put it in a glass or ceramic container. Find your cool space. Start the clock. In 3 days, flip it. In 2 weeks, assess whether the salt has penetrated through. You can tell by the firmness and color change throughout the cut. Begin the equalization. At 4 weeks, make your decision. A soft cure for near-term cooking, or a renewal coat of salt and a cloth wrap for the hanging cure. Hang it. Check it every few days for the first month. Wipe any surface mold with a saltwater cloth. Feel the exterior. It should be getting firmer, not softer. Watch the color deepen. Start learning what preserved meat looks like, smells like, and feels like. The way every woman who came before us learned it, not from a pamphlet, but from paying attention to what the process tells you. At 3 months, cut a piece, cook it, eat it. Understand that you have just done something that the modern food system has spent 70 years telling you was too dangerous, too difficult, and too primitive to be worth your time. It is none of those things. It is $2 and a practice as old as civilization. It is what they knew, and now you know it too. The next video I am going to show you is the method my grandmother used for vegetables, the lactofermentation process that keeps produce alive without any salt at all, just the bacteria already living on the surface of the vegetable itself. A process so reliable that it has fed human beings through winters for longer than recorded history, and so completely removed from the modern kitchen that most people alive today have never seen it done. That video is already published. The link is at the end of this one. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. We are just getting started.